as I was reading more Sword and Sorcery, as I was reading more of these excellent short stories, these novellas, it instilled that idea into me more and more that you don't need a tome to give somebody something worthwhile.
Hi everyone, I'm James, an author, editor, and the owner of The Arcanist, an independent publisher dedicated to sharing excellent fantasy fiction. This is The Morning Edit, the show where you and I sit down with a cup of coffee and talk about all things fantasy publishing, especially from the perspective of the independent author. Today, I'm joined by Lee Patton, co-founder and managing editor of the literary fantasy magazine, and we're discussing his debut novella, A Valley of Shadow, and specifically, what makes it stand out among other fantasy. How can a new indie fantasy author stand out when there's 11,000 other books being flooded on the market every single day? Well, Lee Patton is an avid fan of sword and sorcery and old school heroic fantasy, and what those stories did back in the day was serialize into multiple parts and typically kept themselves in small, bite-sized, stand-alone packages. That is what we're going to talk about today, the benefit of short books and how it can help you stand out in a market saturated by trilogies and decadologies, just a million books, so many books, just so many books that string together that take up your entire life. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that A Valley of Shadow is available now, Halloween 2025. You can purchase it on the Arcanist web store, you can purchase it on Amazon, links will be down below. Without further ado, let's get to the talk. So I showed your book to somebody at work. And he's just like messing. It's like, I really like this length of book. That was the first thing he said. And I'm like, yeah, we're doing that on purpose. Because how are we going to trick people into thinking for themselves? We got to meet them halfway with short books. And this is like especially when it's in the classic size. It'll fit in your pocket. It'll be a little thicker because it went up to 167 pages with the smaller size. Right now it's like 120 on this one. But this is like the perfect thing you bring with you, standing in line at the grocery store. I always say reading on the toilet. That's always how I tell people to read the magazine.
Yeah.
Like, leave your phone, bring the magazine, and read it on the toilet. And read a story, read a poem. A Valley of Shadow is like the perfect gateway drug because it's thoughtful, but it's exciting, and it's short, and it doesn't overstay its welcome. Which it sounds like a backhanded thing, but it's a very good thing because a lot of fantasy overstays. Like I kind of went through a painstaking effort of collecting all the hardcovers of the Wheel of Time.
Okay, yeah.
It took about 2 years to I couldn't find the second one to save my life. But eventually a friend had given it to me for Christmas because he knew I had been looking for it for so long. And I have the whole collection. I don't think I'll ever read it because it's too long. It's too much.
I've got the first 3 books. I've had them for a couple of years now. I still haven't touched them.
Yeah. I already have a massive series in my life. Like, this is a lifelong journey over here.
Well, and that was, like you said, it's absolutely on purpose. That was deliberate choice on my part, is because I knew I wanted to write in genre. Like a lot of us, I was leaning towards fantasy, and like many new authors, I had the thought in my head that I didn't want to do the same thing that everyone else is doing. But then I quickly learned that genre fiction is genre fiction for a reason. There are elements that you have to adhere to. You can do it differently, but you do. And so I started to think, well, what can I really do differently, that will be immediately noticeable, that will immediately set me apart. And of course, I want my writing to be what will set me apart, but that's not actually the first thing that you see. The first thing you see typically is the book itself. And what I found myself when I was looking for I was looking for basic, the classics of fantasy, old and new. So I got new copies of The Lord of the Rings, new copies of A Song of Ice and Fire. Um, I purchased a good chunk of Sanderson's early library, just trying to learn, figure out more what the genre was really about, and to figure out what people are doing now. Part of what landed me with Sword and Sorcery and these smaller, pulpy, quick, high adventure type stories is because I'm looking at the things that were being sold right now, and yeah, there's just I got tired of looking at the endless trilogies, quadrilogies, 8 books, 10 books, 12 books, 14 books. Before I even started reading them, I got tired of simply seeing them. I wanted to read fantasy, but I didn't want to feel like I was making a major life decision every time I picked one out.
Yeah.
Where I'm going with this is actually how I discovered Guy Gavriel Kay. Because I wanted really good standalone fantasy, single books. This is now we're really leading into what helped to generate the format that I was imagining for A Valley of Shadow. And what I realized that I want my contribution to fantasy, contribution as an author of fantasy to be, is that I want to try to bring back the standalone fantasy novel.
Mm-hmm.
Or in the case of A Valley of Shadow, the novella. I'll go shorter. But what I want my readers to be able to do, our readers to be able to do, is to sit down with a book, spend a few hours on it, get a good story, and be done with it. If they want. Of course, I would like for them to read it again as many times as they want. But I don't want our readers to have to feel like they're making a major life decision every time they sit down or consider sitting down with one of my books. And as I was reading more Sword and Sorcery, as I was reading more of these excellent short stories, these novellas, it instilled that idea into me more and more that you don't need a tome to give somebody something worthwhile. You don't need 800 pages to make them think about the things that are most important to them. I've read stories that have managed to do that many times over in fractions of the size, fractions of the word count. That was my guiding philosophy with Rock as a character, the kinds of stories that he would be in, and the kinds of stories that I want to write going forward. I want to be able to give people those novella-sized stories that they can sit down, enjoy, think about things. Maybe they'll hopefully take something good away from them if I'm doing my job right, and then they can move on.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
One of my favorite quotes, I think it was Terry Pratchett who said it. I could be totally wrong, but I've been kind of living by this since I've heard it. Apologies, if I had more time, it would have been shorter. There's a reason why short fiction is the focus of scholarly study. It's why it's what you learn in school. It's because the short story is an extremely effective way to communicate narrative. Some of the best movies I've seen have been based off of short stories, not on novels. Novels always seem like they can't fit in enough stuff, or they do the opposite thing, like with the Peter Jackson Hobbit movies, where they make 3 4-hour-long movies about one 300-page book, and it's just like, now they're adding stuff. But Arrival, 2015, one of the best sci-fi movies I've ever seen, based off of a short story, 50 pages long, by Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang. The movie is a work of art. The short story is a work of art for its own merits. I'm trying to think of other ones. The Body by Stephen King, that was a novella that made Stand By Me one of the most iconic movies of all time. So the point is, the short form narrative isn't anything new, but with attention spans shrinking, why are we putting 1,000 page books in front of people? Like, I know that these are typically a different demographic, but I think universally we all have a problem with our phone and have a harder time focusing than we used to. Whether that is so severe to the point where you can't look at something for more than 3 seconds before moving on to the next thing, which is the average behavior. I've studied this in marketing. It's if your page, you have to make your web pages load up in 2 seconds or less, because if it's 3 seconds or more, you're losing 40% of your audience within that 3 second mark.
That's a lot.
It's pretty wild. So like these patterns exist en masse. So it makes absolutely no sense to me to say, here is an 800-page book. And then not to mention, like, you've done a great job summarizing how readers must feel as a writer. So What Lies Below, here's another one of a kind. You're never going to see it this big again, because I'm splitting it into two so that it'll be... This was intended to be like the beginning of a 4-book series that are all about 400 to 600 pages long, because that's what I expected out of the genre, and it's what I wanted to do. But this book it's still not done, and I've already written a whole nother book, in the meantime. And the problem as an author, you think about these are a different time when these big giant series were coming out. First of all, normal people weren't writing them. Career authors were writing them, who were getting paid advances, that were getting their expenses paid for while they were writing them. I think Steven Erickson's an exception. He wrote Gardens of the Moon first and took about 8 years to sell it, and then once he sold it, he got paid to write the series. But like The Wheel of Time, Robert Jordan was making money whether those books were out or not. We don't have that luxury. So my fear with What Lies Below, before I made the decision to turn it into a standalone duology, was that I would just have this book one that would sit there unanswered for multiple years, which is the death of a series. I mean, nobody will ever read that book two when it comes out in this day and age. You have to hit it fast. And so that's what I was thinking about. What if I'm just not interested in writing that second book? You lock yourself, talk about life decisions. I'm going to write a fantasy series. That's a lifelong commitment. I hope you like writing that same story for the next 10 years of your life. I'm a crop rotator. I can't do that. I have a million different stories I'm writing all the time. I've already told you about probably 2 different book ideas I have. Writing these shorter form series and stories, they give you more accessibility to your readers, but they also open you up for other opportunity. Now I suddenly feel, because I don't have to feel pressured to write 3 more giant books that'll take forever to write. I can work on things that I care about.
So this will tickle your psychology interest. More and more of us are saying this about the book lengths, and I've heard this from quite a few authors at this point, that they're sick of the endless trilogies. Just in terms of like trilogies being released. Just like one of the things that annoyed me when I was looking at fantasy is I would find a book that sounded really cool. It sounded interesting. The artwork was awesome. Book one, instantly put it away and started looking for something else. Mm-hmm. Even the ones I was interested in, as soon as I saw book one of a trilogy, I'm like, nope, don't care. I know I'm not alone in that, but I still have this notion that is still the minority take. And what's confused me, though, is that even if it is the minority take, it does seem to be growing. And if it is growing, it does make me wonder, well, what is with all of these fantasy series? Why are people still doing this, even though when the writing on the wall is saying that it's not actually what people want? Is it just habit? You think from like a publishing writing point of view, is it just habit with fantasy? If you think of being, if a potential author is thinking of being a fantasy writer, because I think that's what actually happened to me, is when I'm like, I think I'm gonna also write fantasy, and the first thing I do is I look at my Lord of the Rings, and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna have to figure out how to do that. It's like, no, you don't. You don't actually have to do that.
Yeah.
But it's almost like we think that we need to. Maybe from the reader's perspective, it's like we're starting to figure out that that's not. This is going to sound contradictory. It's like we're starting to understand that that's not what we want, even if for no reason, then we don't have the time for it, maybe the attention to give it. But it's like it's still what we're expecting to buy. Because I'm thinking the practical answer, well, authors are writing it because that's what people are buying. And I'm like, right, but the same argument, are fantasy readers buying these series out of habit? Or is it simply because they don't know that there are other options, shorter options?
So to answer your question, is it a form of habit? I've talked with authors about this, a few of them, and supported by my own experience, like I had done that because it was what I thought you need to do. I think it is just genre convention, and so it's what people start. I have not met and when I say new author, I mean unpublished and still working on your first book. The majority of those people that I've met are working on their book one of a series. Everybody says that. I saw it all throughout school. Everybody has a series. God help you. You have a series. I understand why. Like a series, it sits with you, right? Like, I mean, I talk all this shit about long books, but my favorite fantasy are a bunch of long books in the main series. It's 21 books total, but 10 in the main stretch. You know, so they have a market, they have a place. But
absolutely.
There is also the fact that the times are changing around our society. And when you look at what types of things are popular at any given time, it's very affected by the politics of the world, by the economy. Here's another reason why people are falling away from series, is that books are expensive now. And like I want to buy, I can't afford to buy one book a month, like as a person. Like I'm very selective about when I buy a book, and I'm not just renting it from my library or, you know, acquiring it in other means. That was a decision I had to think about. And I'm not going to buy your 10 book series. I can't afford it. Like, I'm sorry, but that's a lot of people. So when you have standalones, it's affordable. I can just get this, but also the time. I can't afford the time. My favorite book series, I can't get more than one book a year in. It's just a lot to ask of people in our society to commit to a series. But then at the same time, there are those readers who all they do is read. That's their hobby. That's their free time. And they're on Kindle Unlimited, and they read book after book after book. I always tell people the metrics for sales, like why I don't want to do it as a business decision, is that if somebody buys book one, then 80% of them read it. If you're being generous. 60% of them liked it. 50% of them maybe liked it enough to buy book two. Right. That math compounds down the line, and every book sells worse than the last. Now, I have also heard the opposite. You get somebody hooked, and they keep coming back like drugs. I've talked to multiple authors who, authors who are trying that approach, and then authors who have succeeded in that approach. It's a real thing. So all these things that we talk about are generalities. Like I base my ideal reader off of me. And my persona, my ideal reader, who's James Jr. or whatever, doesn't have a lot of time to read, but reads very deeply. So that's where I really see, that's the reader we're targeting. we're not necessarily targeting the reader who, because those people who will go series after series on Kindle Unlimited, they're not necessarily worried about the literary merit. They're not really even worried if there's typos in it. That's why web novel, Royal Road, those things are so popular, and they're not polished. They don't expect it to be polished. It's a totally different person. But I think a short book respects your reader's time, and it gives you the ability to tell a very focused story. Jumping back to my own writing, Ashen Rider, compared to What Lies Below, a very solid, focused story. It's not a lot of variety. Like, I think there's only one griffin fight scene, really. Maybe we could call 2. But I think where, like, a big fantasy series has to do... Like, if you look at it from the D&D perspective, I need... A classic rule for DMing is I need 5 encounters tonight for every session.
Yeah.
And they have to be different enemies. You have to give the characters the ability to show off their signature moves multiple times. And people take that into fantasy. You have to show something many times in different ways, where the shorter book will show you something once. Like how we were talking about Sword and Sorcery, there's one big fight at the end of the classic. You don't need... It's not and I think video games affect this too. Video games and D&D, because you have these expectations that we carry for gameplay that don't necessarily translate into fiction, but video games are more popular than books. And at this point, new writers are basing their expectations of the genre on video games. Like,
from my classmates, I did see a little bit of that. I don't know that I saw much tabletop RPG influence in the stuff that I read, like the fantasy that I read from my classmates. It was much more often you could feel the video game influence. But it is, and it's kind of in, but not in what you described. There was a little bit of that describing their actions as if you're looking over the shoulder, right? There was a little bit of that. But what I noticed was really interesting to me, because I'm smiling, I'm like, you're a gamer. It's the way their characterization will give it away. You've talked about this a little bit more in your D&D video, how when authors' characters, it feels like you're reading their character sheet. It's kind of related to that, but like in the video game sense. I saw a lot of fantasy characters. The author tried to tell you who they were based on their equipment and what they could do, not who they were. And did they do that characterization? Yeah, they did. It wasn't completely absent. But it's the things that they chose to focus on is what gave it away. It's like, you play a lot of video games, because that's how they see their character. The other thing that really caught my attention that I thought was interesting was, especially in fantasy, I'm seeing more and more the influence of anime.
Oh yeah.
For similar reasons. There's kind of like, especially when I see characters when they're characterized based on their power and what clan they belong to, and how that clan is different than the other clan. And I'm like, so you can definitely spot. It's hard to describe without having an example in front of me, but it's like, even if they're not writing about that kind of thing, it's like you can find the shonen fans just based on, again, the kinds of things that they focus on.
Yeah.
And I'm not even saying that I'm not guilty, might be a harsh word. I'm guilty of that too. I grew up watching anime, much like anyone else our age, a little older, younger. So I get it. I even expect to see it sometimes when I'm reading through some of our submissions. But I think what some of these fantasy authors have to be careful of is that it's really easy to take it too far, too fast. Unless that's what you're going for, if you're explicitly going for an anime inspired fantasy, but I don't think most of them are.
Yeah, I mean, all these problems and mistakes are only problems and mistakes when your goal is to write, shall I say, elevated fantasy that cares about the human condition, does what literary fiction wants to do, which is shine a light on the person. Author in town that I meet with, and I'm reading through his book slowly but surely as I have some time, and it has that anime feel. But it's a good thing. It's really a cool feeling, in fact, to read from a book, because his use of language and characterization is all in that literary sensibility. But then the tone and like the setup, like it kind of opens up with a tournament. You know, there's always a tournament in a shonen. And so it's like, I couldn't put my finger on it. I'm like, why does this feel familiar? Why does this feel comforting? And it's because it feels like those animes I grew up watching that I loved. And I guess I also watched a lot of anime and I read a lot of manga, especially when I was younger. It's not that I don't like it anymore. It's just not really what draws my eye. But
yeah,
that genre of things was never, like, I've always enjoyed it, but it was never like, I want to make something like that. I've never had that feeling. Whereas, like, I read a kind of book or I see them, play a video games are a huge inspiration for me. Specifically, like the Elder Scrolls, especially Morrowind. Like, I look at the scope of those worlds and I think, I want to do that. I want to make... Like, I think that's what got my interest in writing was when I was a kid. I was playing Skyrim, and I had a mod that created a journal, and you'd press X, and a journal would come up, and you could write in the journal. And I would just like...
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I would take daily journal entries for my character, and that's what I did in high school, because I was a loser.
Just a budding creative.
Yeah. Yeah, and that stuff is so cool. I remember I used to write, like, short stories about I try to post them to Wattpad, because I thought that's what you did. That's what everybody was doing in school. But yeah, so you'll find your inspiration in ways, but it's interesting, yeah, when you derive your drive from a certain place, you might focus on different things or have different expectations of the genre. I don't think I really understood, because I definitely had the feeling for a long time that it wasn't fantasy worth looking at unless it was related to the Forgotten Realms in some way. Because I felt like that was like the fantasy, because I played a lot of D&D. I really loved the old video games, the old books that I grew up with. And then I read Erickson I did Martin first. I did A Song of Ice and Fire, and that kind of was a gateway to more thoughtful fantasy. And then Erickson really was just the impetus of, like, I didn't know you could do that for me.
Yeah.
I didn't know fantasy could be so deep. I didn't know it could make you feel things like that and beyond just, like, the power fantasy. And now it's like I kind of look at Forgotten Realms, which... Like, my only point of comparison when I started those books was Paolini's Aragon.
Okay.
I was like, I can't go back to Aragon now because I started reading real fantasy. And now I look at that stuff, and I try to read the Cleric Quintet. It was kind of weird. When I was 19, I read the first one, and I'm like, wow, this was really cool. It was full of intrigue. And I still think it was, but I haven't read it since. I was 22, I read the second book. And I was just kind of bored. It was a lot of fighting. And then I was 24. I read the third book. And I was like a junior in college. So I started getting exposed. And I'm like, this is garbage. This is so bad. If this guy calls describes this man as angular one more time. His angular face, and he's a coward, and can we not go beyond that?
I think I used that once or twice. I don't exactly remember where, but I think it was in there somewhere.
Once or twice is one thing. When it's every other time the character shows up.
One of the things you mentioned Deadhouse Gates a little while ago. I'm gonna say one word. I wonder if you know what it is. Ochre, like the color. It's like a shade brown.
Okay. Yes. Yep. Here, I got one for you. Potsherds.
Yeah, it took me longer than it needed to figure out what that meant.
Yeah,
because I was reading it literally, or is there any other way? Like I was reading it as it was spelled, so I kept saying Potsherds. I'm like, what is that?
Yeah.
And then I finally looked it up. It's like, yeah, it's Potsherds. I'm like, oh, duh.
I had to fit that word into that short story I submitted to Savage Realms Monthly.
Yeah, I saw that.
There was one. Yeah, only one, but... he also, this is a joke in the Malazan community, swung about. He swung about. Everybody's swinging about, flinging their hands around, turning around suddenly. There's just a lot of that. You have your things, and everybody has their things. That was something like we always say to general writing advice: avoid adverbs, the ly verbs, adjective verbs, and. But you read any published author in the last 20 years, they're there. I mean, they're in any book. But why did I say 20 years? It doesn't matter, but...
that's the thing. Because I learned a strong lesson in humility from that same thing when I first got into that the creative writing club on SNHU's social media network. Because originally the idea, it's changed since then, but when I came in, the basic idea was that we were just supposed to submit stories for each other for critique. It was technically the creative writing and review club. They've removed the review, unfortunately. I would put some stories in, and then just trying to learn and help people out, I would actually go through and start reviewing some of the stuff. And that's not the point, just context. But in the effort of doing that, yeah, I fell into the watch your use of adverbs. And it's not bad advice. You should watch your use of adverbs. But the funny thing is, I'm getting really strict about this advice just because I tried to implement it. I don't use them very often. You know this. So as I'm getting more set with this advice and I'm pushing it more and more, and then this is about the time that I really started digging into the classic sword and sorcery, or if you want to get even worse, like stories around Burroughs times, the early 1900s, even those adventure stories, or God forbid you get into the classic literature. It's like they didn't hear about that rule at all, or they actively fought against it. But yeah, as I've been pushing that really hard on people. It's like, cut out your adverbs. Stop using these all the time. Meanwhile, everything I'm reading, they are doing actively, looking about furtively, gesticulating enthusiastically, walking gently to this place, tiptoeing softly to the other. I'm just like, are we just wrong? Is this advice made up?
it changes with the times. And there's a book I read in my British modernism class, Sons and Lovers, I think by D.H. Lawrence. A very strange Freudian tale. But I was listening to the audio because I was doing a lot of traveling at the time. And it was just like the dialogue tags were every sentence. He said, like you said, enthusiastically, he shouted meanly, she did this seductively, like everything. Every line was tagged that way. And I was just like, I remember I had like highlighted a whole page on an ebook and I was going to make a video. I was doing a different YouTube channel that was more like about books than writing. And I was going to make a whole YouTube video about how that was the worst dialogue tagging I'd ever seen. Never came up, but it's... they used to write things differently. People talk about like Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is a good segue because I have one more question to ask you about your book. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written as a serial. And so people reading it as a book now, as a classic book, are frustrated by how repetitive it is. Mm-hmm. But the reality was it was written in a certain way so that readers, you can't expect them to remember what they read in the last newspaper or whatever magazine it came out in. Yeah. Did you find when you're writing A Valley of Shadow, I know you specifically wrote it to be serialized. What did that look like for you?
Well, no, when you started talking about the repetitiveness, I remembered that immediately. Because I remember warning you that there was going to be a little bit of that. Because I kind of, especially moving from Even the Dead Suffer into A Valley of Shadow proper, I remember telling you right away when I was getting started on that second part that I was carrying over some descriptions, and specifically the ending scene of Even the Dead Suffer is very similar in tone and description to the prologue of A Valley of Shadow. And the reason I did that was because Even the Dead Suffer originally only released in the first issue of the magazine. So I had no reasonable expectation that anybody would have read it before getting into A Valley of Shadow. So Even the Dead Suffer ended with the introduction of Alessia and kind of planting the seeds of what the dynamic of Israk and Alessia's relationship was, like her description and how they are with each other. And while the setting is different, I more or less copy pasted that interaction into the prologue of A Valley of Shadow, so that if a reader was coming into A Valley of Shadow without having read Even the Dead Suffer, they would still get that experience. They would still have that context. Now, if someone is coming from Even the Dead Suffer into A Valley of Shadow, it's probably going to be pretty obvious for them. It's like, hey, you're just doing that again. It's like, I know, just I had to.
Yeah. Serials don't necessarily always translate into a book very well. Mm-hmm. Granted, I do think this book manages, because honestly, you said that, and now that I'm looking back on it, I'm like, yeah, that's totally the same setup, but I didn't catch that personally. And I think that, all right. Yeah, I mean, you don't like repeat yourself, but like a similar setup, that's really clever. Because I don't think you would be lost without Even the Dead Suffer, because that was the original plan, was to not just have the story that introduces a character in the print. I always start off on the most convoluted basis, and then I simplify over time. Maybe that's normal, but now what it is when we do a serial is the short story is in the print, and it's like the headliner. It's the very last one. And And then it's also on the website. Because for the next 5 months, you're going to be hearing about whatever Lee or me has worked on for that season for the next 5 months. I found with Ashen Rider, I don't think I serialized it well at all. I think it does well as a novel, but I don't think it is a serial. What it is 5 parts. So it fits evenly on the structure of the website.
Well, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what happened, because it was one of your earlier ones, like you said, you went into the fantasy writing with that expectation of what they were supposed to be, right? You went in with that expectation that it's supposed to be a novel, it's supposed to be like that. And I think because I know we talked about that you wanted to use that as the serial, and that you had to make structural changes to make it work with the division into the parts. And there are aspects of that story, one of them being the multiple perspectives, with just how many of them there are, that may not, with the kinds of the serialized stuff that I've read, I don't think I've seen. I think I've seen maybe. No, that wasn't serialized. I haven't seen any of those stories that have as many perspectives, and I wonder that might be the most prohibitive part, is because following that many people works better if you're reading it in one shot. But on the other hand, like you said, Ashen Rider it's a very focused story. Its scope is small. When you introduce your characters, those are the characters. So I think where you make up for it is that while you have all these perspectives that you have to manage, these stories will be free on the site. So you might not want to, but if you have to go back and review a little bit. But on the other hand, the learning curve is in the first part. Once you introduce your characters, you're not constantly throwing new characters at the reader. So when you meet them and you understand their voice, it then becomes easier then you know whose perspective you're reading from. And then that small scale, personal, focused storytelling is what adapts it to this format. Nothing's perfect. And I think the serial format actually makes it worse. A Valley of Shadow can be very fast. So perhaps, maybe that was one of the places where I might have leaned into the serial thing a little too much with that. I think the pacing in the story overall is very good, but I think there are places that could have been a little bit slower if I wouldn't have taken the serial thing so seriously.
Yeah. Yeah, I noticed. So those middle chapters are the quickest. Like if you look at the website, it'll give you like the reading time. And so those are like, I think one of them was like down to 8 minutes, 12 minutes, 10 minutes. And then the last part was 48 minutes.
48.
So I can see like where your mentality kind of shifted. And there is that midpoint where we've gone through all the background with Israk, and now it is present tense. This is what's happening. And that's where that part 5 comes in with like the second half of the story. Like for the readers, they were slowly getting the background on the website as the parts came out. And there were people who kept up. A handful of them, because we didn't have much of a readership at that point. But, like, and that consistency too, by the way, like I've calculated our circulation as over 100 at this point. We had 0 in January, effectively. So that consistency of putting out that serial helps so much. But you're slowly kind of unraveling this mystery, and then at the very end of the series, the epic finale, you cascade down into the climax, and it's a really good format for that. But then in the book, it translates in a different way where it's half of the book is the setup, the other half is the payoff.
I reject the idea that sword and sorcery isn't literary. So I say that disclaimer because, or I make that disclaimer because maybe the current landscape of sword and sorcery is quite a bit different than what I wrote in some, not many ways, but big ways. And that I had this idea that A Valley of Shadow was going to be heroic fantasy, but I always had to keep in mind that I'm writing it for the literary fantasy magazine. So it had to have a noticeable blending of literary fiction and heroic fantasy. And that's why it has that dual structure. I guess I would still say that there is more or less I think it does follow a 3-act, but in kind of like an unorthodox, lopsided kind of way. Because I think just the way that it's structured, the turning points, like the appropriate beats are there, but they're not necessarily where a textbook is going to tell you they should be. And for the kind of story that it is, I overuse flashback. I would say, maybe from a technical perspective, these kinds of stories don't rely on flashback as a technique that often. That's why I was very careful about making sure that the flashbacks had their own chapter and that they were from the perspective, getting back to the family members. This is part of why I made the decision to have each of those flashbacks from the perspective of the family member that they were relevant to, not Izrak's perspective. Is so that I think it softened the blow of having all of those flashbacks, and it gave them more of that, a sense of purpose that fit really well with the literary aspect that you're looking for.
Yeah, that's interesting you bring up the hesitance there, because that didn't even occur to me. Because for me, flashback isn't a trope. It's not even a word, because a narrative isn't, because people make this mistake because of movies and pop culture, but they think that the story is what's happening in the present tense. The story is the order that the information is revealed to you. A lot of times that's linear from beginning to end, but like a basic iteration upon this is the setup of a movie where you start at the end, like John Wick. You start with him crashing the car at the very, and then you do the whole movie, and then you get back to that moment by the end. That's a simple implementation, but like you could say that Ashen Rider is all flashback because it's covering different timelines, but it's not that like I'm taking you away from the narrative. The thing that happened in the past is just as important as the thing that's happening in the present. It's just you present the information in a way that's logical to unfold it for the reader, not in a chronological order. That was, I think that was, it's one of these two books that really stressed that. I don't know if you read these, if these are pretty. Yeah, okay, cool. This was like one of my favorite ones. The Art of Writing Fiction by Andrew Cohen. Literally every novelist needs to read this. It just answers like simple questions like, how do I format dialogue? And then The Lie That Tells the Truth. I think this one I can't quote as much, but it lives with me in my head. Those books. So anyway, you unfold the story and present information purposefully. So rolling back to A Valley of Shadow, you use the word flashback. I use the word you're revealing information that the reader needs to know. Izrak's past is just as important as his present. Which is, I mean, that's why there's more stories that are going to be told about him. Right?
So we're going to get into it now. So the reason I say flashback is because in the My formalism is going to come at you on this one. So, from a formalist perspective, like flashback is a big thing, a big way that formalism identifies what constitutes literature as opposed to what doesn't, is this idea of delayed revelation. So I could tell a Valley of Shadow without those flashback chapters. It wouldn't be as good. I mean, it wouldn't be, but I could. I could cut out thousands of words of that story and tell the immediate thing that Israk was going through. I could still reveal some of that. I could still reveal the connection that Israk has to the events of that story without relating all of the things in the flashback. But the reason I say that those are flashbacks is because the things that happen in there, while they do relate to things that Israk is going through in the present moment in the story, in the present moment of the narrative, the biggest function that those flashback chapters serve is to show you who he is or who he was. Right? Ultimately, the idea is that you learn who he was to better appreciate who he'll become. When I'm looking at flashback, because I look at flashback not as a trope. I just see it as the technique that it is. And why I was saying that I overused it, the problem it's not that I had a flashback in my narrative at all. When I say I overused it, is the idea that you want to try to keep flashbacks. The advice I've heard, if you can keep it at like a paragraph, that's best. Try not to go more than a page, usually. And so that's what I mean when I said I overused it, in that all of my flashbacks are 3, 5, 7 pages. And so that's why, according to your typical writing convention, they are overlong. And then especially when you throw them into the context of a heroic fantasy, pulp adventure kind of thing, it's like they're definitely way too long. But I think the reason I get away with it is because they serve that literary purpose of delaying the revelation of who Israk is and what led him to, what brought him to the situation that he's in. But when I say brought him to it, I mean psychologically. And those of you that haven't read the story, you'll understand that more when you read it. I know I've mentioned this before, but that was one of the really big concessions that I made with the story. I feel like that's probably the biggest artistic risk that I took, was putting those chapter-long flashbacks in a heroic fantasy story.
I think you made the right decision putting the chapter breaks in, because I agree with that. Keep it at a paragraph when it's in the middle of a chapter. I think there was somebody had told me about, he was reading Dungeon Crawler Carl. I'm not familiar with it, but he was criticizing a scene where it was like, I'm in front of the monster and it's staring me down. And then we had planned this, and then it goes into like 2 pages of the plan.
Oh, no.
It's like, don't put me in front of the monster and then take me into the thing. But what you're doing is you're in the present tense, and you get to a climax and get to a point where it's what's going to happen. Turn the page, new header, change of gears. Okay, we're back into context. We're learning, and those things have their own tension. It's dual stories, dual timelines, rather than interrupting something else. And that's the difference between, like when you say flashback, I think an interruption, where this is just a different mode of narrative. It's pulling back in the most literal way possible.
Well, and that's the difference, because, and why I try to avoid flashback. I appreciate its usefulness, but I don't like it that much as a technique. I'll use it, but the reason I'm wary of flashback is because there is a fine line between interruption and digression. And that's where the artistry is. If you can work flashback in as a smooth digression, a logical transition, that's when it's good. But when the flashback is just interruption, that's what it is. It's distracting. When I was trying to figure out how I was going to integrate the literary fiction elements into a sword and sorcery story, and this is speaking to the structure, why the first half is the way it is, and then the second half is. Basically, what I realized is that to tell the story that I wanted to tell, I couldn't. If I tried to put them together, the flashbacks would be too short, right? If I wanted, I could tell those things in a paragraph or a page, but they would be devoid of much of their meaning, because those flashbacks are where a lot of my slower moments are. This is where the history and a lot of the characterization, the history is revealed, some of the world building, where the characterization happens, a lot of it. And that takes words. It just does. And so what I realize is that I know you really liked the interaction between Israk and his wife. I remember you really liked that part. And just as an example, at that point in the story, I could have tried to condense that into a paragraph or a page, but that kind of thing has to build. It wouldn't have had the same impact.
Yeah.
And so why did I structure it the way that I did? Well, essentially, I felt like I had to. My idea was that, okay, the first half is going to be the literary half. And then once I get the setup done, once the exploration of the human condition as it's particularly relevant at that point in the narrative is resolved, I'm like, okay, that's when I'm going to switch gears into the sword and sorcery, and then we're just going all in. And that's why I released part 5 as that section, because at that point things are happening chronologically, one after the other. And so I'm like, okay, I don't want a lot of breaks here, because they're going full throttle into the climax of that story, and I don't want the reader to have to stop. Now, that's more relevant to the serial release. With the novella, it's all going to read. It's all going to flow together. The beats of the 3-act structure do exist in that story. The way it's cut in half as if it's not. I guess that's what I'm saying. It's like they're there, but not necessarily in the way that you would expect, I suppose.